Welcome to Afterwards. I'm Toby Harnden of the Sunday Times of London, and with me today is Kwasi Kwarteng, a Conservative MP who's born in London of Ghanaian parents, and he's here to discuss his superb new book, War and Gold, a 500-year history of empires, adventures and debt. It's received rave reviews already. My own paper described it as enormously readable and an entertaining history which turns the past 500 years into a rollicking narrative. So great to have you here.
Very good to be here. Thank you.
Now, rollicking narrative is not usually the description you get for politicians' books, and this strikes me as not really a politician's book. This isn't designed to sort of get you further up the greasy pole.
No.
Why did you write it?
Well, I've always been interested in history. That was what my major was in. I've also got a doctorate in history. And I think that when we look at what happened in 2008, the financial crisis, huge amounts of debate, loads of books, but they all looked at very short-term perspective, through a short-term perspective. They were looking at the banks, they were looking at maybe hedge funds, they were looking at CDOs and credit derivatives. But I thought, hang on, let's take a step back and actually try and understand something about the global financial system, something about the currencies that we have, the dollar, sterling, and also the nature of gold as well, because one of the features of this book is to remind people that we, for 400 years, for 450 years, of the 500-year period, we had a gold-backed currency.
Yeah.
And it was only in 1971 when Richard Nixon famously went off gold. He shut the gold window.
Now tell me about that. One of the things I love about this is you have an eye for the dramatic moment.
That's right.
And I mean, it's about, you know, an ostensibly sort of dry subject, sort of money.
Sure.
But tell me about that moment in 1971 when the TV programme was interrupted.
Well, there are key moments in any history, in any historical narrative. There are always going to be key moments when people just step back and think, oh my God, this is what's happening. And 1971, it was August the 15th, I think, on a Sunday, was very much one of those moments when Richard Nixon essentially appeared on national television halfway through Bonanza, which is this great cowboy show. It's probably not really my time, but maybe viewers will remember that show. And he interrupted the show to say, we're not going to allow the dollar to be converted into gold anymore. And this, in many ways, was one of the most significant events, the most significant things to have happened in the history of money. And it was a very decisive moment where essentially he shut the gold window, that's what the term was, where people could not simply come into Fort Knox, metaphorically, and say, here, at $100, I want to get the gold value. And that was as a consequence of, you know, the big, bad problems that the American government, the federal government, had got into with its debt. They were trying to fight the Vietnam War and also pay for the Great Society. And it just didn't work out. There was a huge, there was a deficit, there was a trade deficit. And people like the French and bad people like the Brits were coming to change dollars into gold. And so Richard Nixon decided to stop that. Interestingly enough, the federal chairman at the time, the head of the Federal Reserve, Arthur Burns, was very skeptical about that. I mean, he was an old school kind of balanced budget conservative guy. And he was very wary of actually stopping, decoupling the dollar from gold in that way. And
another key moment, dramatic moment, is Lloyd George in the House of Commons in 1914.
That's right.
Another big year.
We see the great thing about British public finance for the 100 years before the First World War, before 1914, was essentially they ran balanced budgets. I mean, it's difficult to imagine that now, but the whole of the Victorian era and the 19th century, and these guys with top hats.
And a stable interest rate.
Very stable interest rates, very stable fiscal policy. And what happened in the First World War, and this is one of the key moments of the book, was that all of that just went to pieces. So in order to defeat the Kaiser, in order to defeat Germany, the British Parliament essentially had to vote through massive spending. And he stands up and says, you know, this is an extraordinary thing that we've done. We're going to now borrow billions of sterling, whereas generally it had been hundreds of millions, the budget, up to that point. But they borrowed huge amounts. The national debt went up 10 times, if you can imagine, more than 10 times. So from about 700 million sterling to over 11 billion. And the House of Commons just nodded it through because they would do whatever it took to defeat Germany. That was the attitude. And
obviously a thread right the way through here, and in the title is this sort of push-pull effect of war.
Absolutely right.
and money. And you contemplated calling the book Order and Chaos.
Order and Chaos, that's right. I mean, I'll tell you, I mean, order, I think, is represented by the gold standard, or by a commodity standard, where you can see that, this is how much my dollar or my pound is worth, and it's linked to some sort of external value, a commodity, for example. Chaos, and one of the arguments I put forward in the book is that we're in a period of relative chaos at the moment, is when you don't have any kind of mooring to commodities. You have what is called fiat money, paper money, and essentially you're just at the mercy of the printing press. You can just keep printing money. And there is a strand of opinion, certainly in this country, probably more than any other, which says that was a mistake. We should get back to the gold standard. It's associated with people like Ron Paul and people like that. But my this isn't a polemic. I'm not trying to write a really good narrative to explain how we got to where we are. But I think there is some force in the argument that, hang on, we need something more structured than just the ability of governments to print money.
Yeah, I mean, the quotes from Ron Paul and his co-author in, I think, 1981,
That's
saying the 10-year experiment with paper money has failed.
That's right.
And I mean, that is an argument that is very, very resonant here. I mean, there was a big following for Ron Paul in 2008, 2012. His son, Senator Rand Paul, is probably going to run for president in 2016. I mean, do you think we should return to the gold standard? Could we?
Well, there's a different factor in terms of how we could. I'll talk about that initially. The only way we can get back to the gold standard, I mentioned that in this book, is for the Chinese, essentially, to decide unilaterally. They could reinstitute the gold standard tomorrow. They could say, right, a yuan or a renminbi is going to equal X amount of gold. And they've got enough reserves to back that. The only problem for them is that they run an export model. So if they did that, the yuan would become a very, very strong currency, which would be complete reverse of their export-led growth policy, where they want to keep the value of the yuan low so that their exports are cheap and we can buy them, essentially. So that would be a complete reversal. But in terms of actually introducing a gold standard, they can do it because they've got the reserves. And one of the points I make about the gold standard is that if you look at the 19th century, it was Britain who largely sort of guaranteed it. And Britain was running great export surpluses. I mean, Britain was the manufacturer of the world. British goods were flooding, essentially, global markets, not least in America, in South America. And the reserves that Britain acquired through its export trade meant that they could keep a gold standard. Now, the British themselves, we never really had that much gold, but everyone sort of relied on the stability and the export strength of Britain. Similarly, in the 20th century, for much of the 20th century, the United States ran current account surpluses. I mean, it's unbelievable to think that. But really, until 1970, from about 1900 to 1970, the US was exporting more than it was importing. So it was building up reserves. It was building up gold and other foreign currency reserves. And they really, the United States, guaranteed the gold standard, certainly after the First World War. And of course, the whole Bretton Woods settlement was based on this talismanic value of the dollar at $35 an ounce. That was how an ounce of gold. That was the relationship. And that lasted from 1944 to 1971, as we were talking about earlier.
So it sounds like you don't anticipate the Chinese doing this. It wouldn't be in their interest.
They wouldn't. I mean, given where they've come from in the last 25 years, they've deliberately forced their currency to be much lower, and I outlined that in the book. I mean, if you look at 1980, I think it was something, the yuan was 1.5 yuan to a dollar. And then over 20 years, it went down as low as about 8.5. And now it's sort of 6.5, that sort of thing. But they deliberately had a very cheap money, or rather low, they wanted low value for their currency so they could drive exports. So you're right to suggest that if they went to gold, that would be a complete reversal of what they've been doing, of how they've been building their economy through this export growth.
So are you arguing that a return to the gold standard will be impractical?
I think it's impractical. I think it's impractical. But what I am saying is that the current system is very vulnerable. And in a way explains what happened in 2008. And I talk about that quite fully. I mean, I mentioned the fact that many economists actually predicted that this would happen when you have a system where you've just got a fiat currency, banks essentially are just pushing enter and printing money. You're going to get a very vulnerable and unstable system. And I think that's something that we have to consider.
Now, what about the effect of war on 2008? Because obviously 9/11, 7 years earlier.
That's right.
But your argument is that it wasn't just about 9/11 and war spending. It was about something much bigger.
Well, it was a very it wasn't that complicated. But if you remember, I mean, I was on the trading floor in 2001, and the first thing that happened.
You worked for JP Morgan.
I was at JP Morgan. That's right. I hope that's not a swear word here in this context. But yeah, I was a banker. And the first thing that happened was obviously the FTSE 100, our index, went down 10%. The Dow Jones went down, I think, an appreciable amount, the same sort of amount. And what the response of the central bank was to lower interest rates. I mean, interest rates had been coming down all through that year from about 6.5%. They went down to 1%. And this is really, really cheap money. And my argument was that if you followed what happened as a consequence of the lowering of the interest rate to such a low degree, what happened was that people wanted yield. There was a search for yield. So if you're getting treasuries at 2%, 10-year money at 2%, and you're some banker in the Midwest, you're thinking, hang on, I need to get more than 2%.
So that pushes you to the margins, to the big higher risk?
Absolutely, that's absolutely right. It pushes you to think, look, I can only get 2% at 10-year money, you know, buying treasuries. I've got to get some interest rates. I've got to get some yield, the search for yield. And that was a phrase that was used commonly at the time. And the search for yield, I think, drove a lot of the subprime lending, a lot of the very poor credit decisions in terms of expanding credit, in terms of giving people huge loans which they could never afford to pay. And that was what caused this kind of instability. And actually, this is where the long view is very interesting, because I found exactly the same thing happened in England in the 1820s.
So the South Sea bubble?
Well, no, it was after the South Sea bubble, but it was South American.
Okay. So
what happened was that after the Napoleonic War, after 1815, you know, Sharp and the defeat of Napoleon, Sharp's Rifles is a popular TV show, but in Britain. But after that, they went back to gold. And as a consequence of that, the government spending went down. It was, again, a very low interest rate environment. And there was, again, this search for yield. They were saying, well, you know, if we buy UK government debt, we're only going to get, you know, small interest rates on that. So let's look for something which is going to give us more interest rates. And so there was this search for yield, which then they ended up buying crazy kind of Bolivian government bonds, paying 7%, crazy, very speculative sort of Argentinian stocks, all that kind of thing. And they blew up.
So if we can't go back to gold now, how do we sort of moor the currency? How do we sort of stabilize it and stop another bubble?
I think what the main thing that is missing from this is, and this is what people in the markets feel, and I think people generally feel, is that there should be more leadership. There should be more international coordination. I mean, if you look at Bretton Woods, that lasted 3 weeks. I mean, obviously there was 2 years of preparation before that. But essentially, you had delegates from about 50 countries. They came to Bretton Woods, this resort in New Hampshire, and they decided what the international architecture would be. And that was a very responsible and very effective. I mean, it lasted from 44 to 71.
Yeah.
In this current crisis, we have not really been able to reach the level of international cooperation. There's been a sort of slight lack of leadership, perhaps. People are slightly feeling less confident, and there's less of an idea of what can be done.
Right.
And I think that's really come about in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, and people see that. And one of the things about that is that, in a way, I think it's come at a time. The 2008 crisis came at a time when global leadership, I mean, the US is feeling perhaps less sure of itself. The US itself is running huge deficit.
We should talk about that.
Which we can talk about later. And the US has been slightly burnt by perhaps overextension in foreign affairs, foreign commitments. So the capacity of the US to provide that kind of global leadership is much lower now than it perhaps certainly was the case in 44, or the post-war period.
But are you an advocate of greater regulation? I mean, you're not a bash the bankers type of person at all.
Not at all. I mean, I'm always, certainly in the House of Commons, I'm always a very robust defender of the free enterprise system. Yeah. I'm a very robust defender of finance. I mean, if you look at my hometown, London, I mean, London has been the centre of international finance for 300 years. I mean, arguably today, and apologies to New Yorkers listening, it is still the leading international centre in terms of the numbers of international banks, the time zone, and the idea that British politicians should bash bankers and try and close down the City of London, I mean, is insane. That's been a great strength of the British economy. That's what I always argue. And I think it's borne out by the historical record.
Now, in terms of debt and deficits, I mean, the fascinating chapter on Thatcher and Reagan, where, I mean, as my sort of understanding of your sort of portrayal is that that what went out of the window was balanced budgets.
That's right.
And it was tax cuts became almost, not your word, but mine, almost maybe a fetish and sort of an end in themselves.
That's right.
And that I think to a lesser extent Thatcher, but certainly Reagan sort of taught the talk about fiscal responsibility, but in the end...
Well, Reagan was a great figure. I mean, he had unparalleled gifts of communication. So he could boil things down very simply so that people could relate to them. And of course, his idea, he was very much, his great metaphor about government spending was that he related it to alcoholism.
Right. And
his father had been an alcoholic. So if you look at his speeches, certainly from the early 80s, he keeps talking about, we've been on this massive binge, yeah. We've got a terrible hangover, we need to sort ourselves out. And that was the rhetoric, the metaphors he used. When you actually look at his record throughout the 80s, then yes, you're right. There was, because of defense spending, because of the Cold War, there was this deficit. And that was the time, I think, when certainly people on the conservative side of the argument here in America were very focused on tax cuts, regardless of expenditure. And my argument was that right through really to the 60s, the US conservatives were balanced budget people.
Yeah.
So what they did, if you look at the Korean War, I know that was Truman, a Democratic president, but certainly Eisenhower continued that. They weren't reluctant to raise expenditure to raise income, raise taxes, to cover expenditure. So I think in the Korean War, the president went to Congress, they raised taxes, and they paid for that because they wanted to balance the budget. And that was very much a sort of old school conservative approach. And both Eisenhower and Truman stuck to that. It was only really in the 60s that you started getting these endless deficits. And in a way, my argument is that the conservative movement in America wanted endless tax cuts.
Yeah.
Because they said the tax cuts would increase revenue. But they didn't really focus on the expenditure side.
Yeah.
And I think if you're going to reduce taxes, you've got to try and reduce expenditure.
Yeah.
It's no good reducing taxes hoping you'll get more money from that while keeping expenditure rising.
Yeah.
And this argument, this sort of supply side argument, people like Jack Kemp in the late 70s and obviously Arthur Laffer very famously, focused on tax cuts. But in order to balance the budget, you've got to address expenditure.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can't just balance the budget on tax cuts alone.
Yeah.
And even though I'm, in an ideal world, I would reduce taxes and reduce expenditure, but the two have got to go together.
Right. And George W. Bush, I think you described him as fiscally incontinent at one point.
It wasn't my words. I mean, it was very. I mean, Bush was an extraordinary president in a way because he's attacked from the left and from the right, because of his fiscal incontinence. So I think if you look at that period from 2001, the U.S. started running deficits quite aggressively. And those deficits were compounded by the foreign affairs, the foreign wars that the Bush government went into. And I think people on the left and the right, certainly on the right, were saying, what's happened to this? We're supposed to be the balanced budget guys. Yeah. We're supposed to be hawks on public expenditure. We want to reduce the federal government and its impact in terms of spending. But the spending's going out of control.
Yeah.
And it wasn't me. I mean, it was a lot of the guys from the think tanks, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, all that sort of thing, were always, even at the time, I mean, before 2008, were criticizing Bush for spending too much money.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that led to the Tea Party movement here. Yes?
That's right. So the Tea Party, I think, was a legitimate protest at this endless cycle of deficit expenditure. And the federal debt was going through the roof, the deficit was going through the roof, and you forget, I mean, people forget that in America, the budget was balanced. And in my country, in Britain as well, the budget was balanced in the late 90s. I mean, I remember when I started work in the late 90s, they were saying that the 30-year bond, the T 30-year bond, would be abolished because the government wasn't borrowing any more money. And so in 15 years, we've gone through the completely reversal of that position. And I think, in my book, I argue that the Bush administration had a part to play in that reversal. Yeah.
And so how do you view the Clinton era of the 1990s, not the possible Clinton era?
No, I mean, I don't know about the 2016. I mean, it's, who knows about that. But certainly the Clinton was, I mean, if you just look at the numbers, if you just look at where the budget was, it was quite a responsible time in the sense that public expenditure didn't rise. It rose a little bit, but not as fast as it would subsequently. Tax revenues were, because of the booming economy, were increasing. And the budget was largely balanced. Now, a lot of his opponents will say that a lot of the problems were deep-seated, that he didn't address in terms of entitlements and social security and that sort of thing. But year on year, the budget was very balanced. And I quote Greenspan when he came to Congress in 2001. And if you read what he was saying, I mean, it's extraordinary. He was saying that essentially we're going to abolish the national debt.
The glide path to zero debt.
That's right. But that was the environment in 2000, 2001.
Yeah.
There was very much the view, this is pre-9/11, that somehow, you know, we'd discovered perpetual motion. The U.S. economy was growing at 3 to 4% every year. You know, public expenditure wasn't going up very fast. And
that was based on some very, very optimistic estimates, which were not shared by everybody even at the time.
They weren't shared by everyone at the time, but the fact that a chairman of the Federal Reserve could come to Congress and speak, as you mentioned, of the glide path to zero debt in 2001, the summer of, before 9/11, is extraordinary, given where we are now. It is extraordinary that 15 years ago, people actually thought, credibly thought, that they would have abolished the national debt, the federal debt, certainly by 2014.
And so what is your view of Alan Greenspan? I mean, there's a lot about him.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was I think the most important thing about him, I mean, I'm a historian, so I look at what people do, their sort of personalities, because I think that's very important. And one of the most interesting things about him was that he loved jazz music. He was a jazz, sort of player, clarinetist, I think, or saxophone, in the 40s. And I would suggest that he took very much a jazz player's approach to managing the economy. It was very improvised.
Yeah.
I quote people who worked with him who said the plan was there was no plan.
Yeah.
He was very, very savvy about, well, he felt himself to be very savvy about markets. He responded very quickly to what the markets were doing. And the most important thing about him in terms of his career was very early on in '87, early on in his tenure as chairman of the Federal Reserve. He essentially, in his own mind, saved the Western world, right, because of the crash of '87. Yeah. It was a big Wall Street crash.
Which would prompt a certain degree of self-confidence.
That's right. So that was the trick he played at that time. Very, very, very cheap money. He lowered interest rates. He pumped huge amounts of liquidity into the system. And he averted a 29-style disaster in '87. That was very much. And so once you do that very early on in your career, and you play those tunes again, don't you? I mean, if you're successful doing one policy very early on, the temptation is to keep repeating it, which is essentially what he did. And now I would argue by 2002, 2003, the very, very cheap money policy stored up its own problems, as we've talked about. Low interest rates, again, the search for yield, and then people sort of investing in very high risk products to get that yield. Right. And that's what created the instability.
And Ben Bernanke, I think you describe him, he comes across as sort of an obsessive sort of interventionist.
Yes, I mean, that was very much the style. I mean, so I think Greenspan set the ball rolling in '87. And one thing you've got to remember about all of these people running the Federal Reserve is that they are obsessed with 1929. And the one lesson that they've learned from 1929 is that...
And Bernanke had written...
he's written papers and done research. And they're obsessed with the idea that in '29, the Federal Reserve, the authorities, if you like, didn't do enough. And they contracted the money supply at the wrong time and all the rest of it. So this endless liquidity, pumping liquidity into the system was very much their response from what they'd learned.
Do you think it was the right response?
I think to do it willy-nilly as they did was perhaps slightly risky. I think that they perhaps overlearned, or perhaps learned some of the wrong lessons from '29. And what people like Friedman pointed out was that in '29, the authorities made it worse by shrinking the money supply. They didn't need to do that. But this idea, these endless bailouts, these endless huge amounts of money that people can't even comprehend, I think created potentially its own instability, and also alienated a vast section of Middle America. I mean, the Tea Party revolt was very much initiated or given fuel by these endless bailouts and this endless printing of money and this endless spending. And that's what people really got cross about. And we're still seeing the ramifications of that now.
And you talked about, certainly rhetorically at least, in the sort of Reagan-Thatcher era, a lot of talk about sort of the household budget and,
That's right.
and putting things in a very simple, not simplistic, but simple
manner.
You know, although as you say, they're kind of diverted perhaps from the balanced budget. But now we have this sort of system where you have a currency that's sort of untethered, a sort of jazz approach to managing it.
That's right.
And these huge, as you say, like
billions,
figures trillions of figures you have to Google to sort of begin to comprehend.
That's right.
And so how, I mean, I guess for the average American, you know, I think how do we get back to some sort of sanity and something that people can understand?
Well, what I argue in that book, in my book, and what I think people are, from all sides of the political spectrum, are looking at, is you're going to have to balance the budget at some point.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly in the UK, in my country, the argument isn't about whether we balance the budget, it's how quickly we get to balance. Because endless deficits simply isn't sustainable. Yep. And I think there's a more of a consensus about that than people might realize.
Yeah.
Now, how you balance the budget and over what time frame, these are political discussions that are...
Entitlement reform, huge.
All of that is very important. But I think that certainly if we're going to get back to stability over the next 10, 20 years, I think a balanced budget approach is something that people are beginning to focus on. Even though the rhetoric might suggest otherwise, because there are all these endless debates in Congress, which I follow, about the budget and all the rest of it. But I don't think even the most extreme Democrat is suggesting that we run deficits from now on, you know, to kingdom come. I don't think anyone is suggesting that.
And have you talked to American politicians about this? I mean, this should be, I imagine, a book that people like someone like Paul Ryan or anybody really on Capitol Hill.
I mean, they should. I mean, it's getting, as you say, rave reviews. I think it's an important book because it's trying to bring back this idea of the balanced budget straight into the political mainstream. I'm trying to show that balanced budgets are what made Britain and America very, very powerful countries over the time in which they held a preponderant power in global affairs. So I think it's very, very timely and important. And I have spoken to one or two people about this. I mean, I tend to have, I'm a conservative politician, so I tend to be more hawkish on public spending than perhaps some of my other colleagues. But this is definitely something which is being talked about.
Yeah, yeah. And so, I mean, broadly speaking, as the terms that are used, simplistic terms in the sort of public debate is sort of growth versus austerity.
That's right.
And I mean, is that a useful way of looking at things?
It's a slightly crazy way of looking at it. I mean, so the argument about growth, which was first, it's a very new argument. I mean, in the context of 500 years. It's only really in the 60s that people started saying, and it was sort of Lyndon Johnson, JFK, towards the end of his brief, tragic tenure of the presidency. They started saying, well, we shouldn't worry about balancing the budget, because if we run the deficit, we'll get more growth, and therefore we'll be able to balance the budget. Right. In the medium term. So it's a kind of circle argument. So what do? I've got a deficit. So, well, let me run the deficit more so that I can get more growth and get more money in, and then to pay off the deficit, to pay off the debt. And it's a circular argument.
Right.
And you didn't really hear it until the early 60s. And that's a point I make in the book. So it's associated with the name of Keynes, and they talk about Keynes this and Keynes that. But Keynes himself realized that deficit spending was an exceptional thing. When there was a slump, he said you can spend more money. But he didn't envisage, he never dreamt of people running deficits year in, year out. Yeah. And that only really came in the 60s. And of course they adopted this circular argument saying, well, we won't deal with the deficit because we need to have growth in order to deal with the deficit. So we need to run a deficit to get growth. I mean, it's a slightly crazy argument. And you hear it now a lot. I mean, people like Krugman and people on the left are very enamored of this argument. But it's not a Keynesian argument.
Right.
I mean, Keynes himself grew up in the Victorian era. He was 31 when the First World War broke out. So his whole childhood and his youth was conditioned by this balanced budget framework. And that he thought was the norm. And he said, look, in exceptional times, you can borrow money. But he wasn't envisaging that all the time. And the analogy I use is, you know, if you have kids, the Victorian approach, if they had TVs, I suppose, which is a big if, would be you can't watch television, ever. Keynes's view was, okay, you can watch 2 hours, you know, when you need to. And now we've got a point where the TV's on all the time.
Right, 150 channels.
Absolutely. So, you know, so to invoke Keynes for these sort of deficit, you know, keep growing the deficit in order to get growth, ideas, I think is wrong, because you've got to understand him in his historical context. And that historical context, as I've outlined in this book, War and Gold, is that, you know, the UK government balanced the books. They balanced the budget. And that's what the government, that was a key function of government. And that was actually agreed by both sides, you know, both the Liberals, as then was, and the Conservatives.
You talked about China earlier. Where is China in all this? Often described as sort of America's banker.
Sure.
And I was interested in the section you talked about some of the rhetoric from Republican politicians, Mitt Romney in 2012,
That's
talking
right.
about naming sort of shaming
That's right.
China as a currency manipulator on day one of his presidency, which never happened.
Never happened.
And he talks about sort of the economic nationalism on
That's
the
right.
right.
I mean, the economic nationalism has always been a theme in America. I mean, there are people like Pat Buchanan who talk about this. I mean, they've been on the fringes of the debate in many ways. But if you look at the 19th century, America was the great protectionist country. I mean, that's a historical fact.
Yeah.
We can argue about whether it was the right thing or the wrong thing. The fact is, as someone described to me, the American industrial base was built behind a high tariff wall. That's just what happened. And so the argument on the right is very much has been about, or shaded into, sort of, as you say, the economic nationalism, and the idea, and actually it's not just about economic nationalism. It's also about having a level playing field. So, you know, if I'm exporting cars into China, I probably have a 15% sort of tariff to get my goods into China. Whereas if I'm a Chinese exporter, you get a 15% subsidy.
Right.
And so a lot of the trade argument is about equalizing that playing field.
And there's anecdotes about Harley Davidson, which I
That's right. Yeah. I mean, again, these things are always more complicated, aren't they? I mean, the Reagan is portrayed as this great free trader. But you know, he saved Harley Davidson by, I think it was a 30% tariff. Yeah. Because all these in the early 80s, people will remember, all these Japanese motorbikes were flooding America, right, and Harley Davidson was going bust, and he slapped a tariff on these Japanese motorbikes, and saved the domestic industry.
So if China had been named and shamed in that way, what would the effect have been? Would that have just been basically domestic sort of populism?
Yes, I think it would have been. And also, you see, the problem is that there's still a massive demand for these Chinese goods. Right. And you can't legislate against that. I mean, I suppose you could slap tariffs, but then we could get them from somewhere else, couldn't we? The naming and shaming, you could. I mean, this was the Greenspan argument. The Greenspan argument was that if we impose tariffs or we on China, you know, Malaysia and the Southeast Asian industrial base, if you like, would provide goods anyway. It wouldn't help the U.S. manufacturers. That was his argument. But if you look at where China started from, and we mentioned this earlier, in 1980, the renminbi was 1.5 renminbi to a dollar. Over about 20 years, that rate went up to about 8.5. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't something that just happened because it happened. It was an act of deliberate policy. And the Chinese, what the strength of the Chinese compared to ourselves in the West, in Britain and America, if you like, is that they have a very long-term view. So American politicians were accusing the Chinese of currency manipulation in the early 90s. I mean, Bush 1 in about 91 was saying, hang on, you guys are manipulating your currency. You're driving your currency down to flood our markets. But of course, there's a new president. There's always a new cycle. Yeah. The Chinese kept doing the same thing.
But the Chinese are very contemptuous of this American election cycle.
That's right. Because they have a steady plan, and that's what I try to outline in the book with regard to their own currency, which they developed. I mean, it's very easy to forget this, but as late as the sort of late 80s, about 85, 86, probably a bit later than that, China was running a trade deficit, if you can imagine that. They were importing more than they were exporting. And I referred to various articles in the New York Times from that period, which was saying, you know, that they've got a trade deficit. And you could argue that because the renminbi, they devalued the renminbi, that trade deficit became a trade surplus, which it has remained.
Now, you're a relatively unusual British politician.
Sure.
You've got a sophisticated knowledge and experience of the United States historically, but you also spent, was it a year at Harvard? As
I spent an excellent year in Boston or in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
When was that?
At Harvard University, 96, 97.
Right.
So I kind of lived through a lot of that crazy period. I mean, it was an interesting time because a lot of my classmates, people who were my age, were going straight into Wall Street on very big salaries. This was just before the dot-com boom, but a lot of them went into that. So it was those were kind of go-go years. There were cigar crazes and all that sort of thing. Consumption, high living, all of that sort of thing. There was quite a kind of Wild West period, I think, in finance. And of course, that all came to a grinding halt, certainly after 9/11. And there was a very long bear market. Well, a short and sharp bear market when the tech bubble burst. I mean, that burst sort of 2000. And people forget that. That was a difficult time for the markets.
And given your sort of historical knowledge of America and your sort of personal experience, what strikes you as the big sort of differences in the sort of economic and political debates on either side of the Atlantic?
I think in America, people are much more conscious of this whole public spending idea. And I was amazed. I mean, I used to cover debates, for newspapers in Britain at the time.
So you sort of briefly a journalist.
That's right. Before going into
finance,
politics and finance. But yes. So what amazed me about these congressional debates was that often, I think one time in '96 they were arguing about $300 million, which sounds like a lot of money, but the budget was something like 1.6 trillion or 1.3 trillion. And this is a very, very, very focused and very passionate debate. And I think that level of budget scrutiny doesn't quite exist, certainly in Britain and perhaps in Western Europe. I think, and the whole language and culture about, pork, earmarks, all of that, those sort of terms. These aren't terms that are used in Europe.
But do you think Britain and Europe could learn some of it? Some of this?
I think we could have a more hawkish. I mean, you could argue that the defense was the debate was irrelevant because people talked about all this stuff, but they continued spending the money. So you could argue that all of that intense scrutiny on that didn't really amount to much. But I think having a conscious approach, a very, very critical approach to tax dollars, that phrase, tax dollars. No, I've never heard the phrase tax euros. You see what I mean? So I think people here have a more fundamental sense of the idea that taxation comes from the people, comes from the people's work, and is spent by the government. Whereas I think in Europe there's more of a kind of casual acceptance of government spending. Somehow the government's spending its money. Or they don't really make the connection between.
There's a real sense here that this is sort of our money.
That's right.
And there's sort of anger, genuine anger that you're spending it.
Yes, absolutely right. So there's the we the people on one side, and the government, which is extracting money from the people through taxation and then frittering it away. That's part of the kind of Tea Party view of life. Whereas in Europe, I think Europeans and British people probably have a slightly more benign view of government.
Certainly, I think,
and so that benign view means that the government's spending money for us, and there isn't that sense of this is my money, like Gollum in the Hobbit, the pressures.
Well, wasn't it the Reagan line, the sort of joke, I'm from the government, I'm here to help.
Absolutely right. And so there's a much more, and there are probably deep-seated reasons for that. I mean, if you look at the birth of the origins of the United States. It was a revolt against the government. I mean, it was a revolt against absolutely, and no taxation without representation. So that's very much more deep-seated, I think, in the American consciousness than it is in Europe.
Now we've sort of mentioned the Tea Party a couple of times. Of course, the big sort of political story in Britain at the moment is the rise of UKIP, the UK Independence Party. What's your view on this? Are we now in a 3- or 4-party system in Britain that we haven't had before? Well,
I mean, it's interesting you raise that, Toby, because we've just had European elections last week in which UKIP, this fourth party, if you like, topped the poll. And that's the first time, I think, since 1906, that's 108 years, when neither Conservative nor Labour, the two main parties, have won a nationwide election. So it's very significant. And we don't actually know where this will end up. UKIP, ostensibly, their main reason is to try and get Britain away from Europe. They want us to leave the EU. But it's a much wider sort of cultural revolt against a political class that they feel is out of touch, that is elitist, that doesn't connect to ordinary people, that lives in its own bubble, that is very much drawn from the same type of person. Even though they're different parties, they're all pretty much the same.
Sort of political class elite.
That's right, that's right. And it's very much a kind of anti-establishment, peasants' revolt type situation, which in America I think people are very familiar with.
Yeah. So you see some parallels between UKIP and the Tea Party.
There are clearly parallels. I mean, there's clearly. I mean, we're in Washington now, but you know, and Westminster is much smaller than Washington, but it has the same sort of resonance. You know, these are people who go to fancy restaurants, they wear fancy suits, they speak a language that we don't understand, they're completely cut off their constituents, and they essentially, regardless of who's in power, whether it's Democrat or Republican, the spending goes up, and there's no responsibility, there's no accountability, and a bunch of guys in what you call Main Street are saying, we've had enough. And there's this sort of popular insurgent aspect to it. And Farage, Nigel Farage, who is the leader of UKIP.
Who's a sort of smoking, drinking.
Yeah, smoking, drinking. I mean,
bloke in the pub.
Absolutely. I mean, he gets, you know, he can get photographed with a pint of beer in a way that no politician would dream or dare to do. And so there's very much the view that these people are out of touch, and it's time for direct action. And he calls his army the People's Army, his troops, his party. He calls it the People's Army, and that's very much the kind of peasants with the pitchforks over the hill,
right.
You know, coming and they've saying they've had enough.
And so, do you think your party, the Conservative Party, can learn from UKIP? I mean, is it going to be about trying to bring them into the tent or push them?
Well, this is the $64,000 question. I mean, I suspect that the centre-right, this is my own private view, the centre-right in Britain needs to have some sort of accommodation at some point with UKIP. Because it's very difficult, given our parliamentary system, to see how a Conservative Party can get an overall majority without a lot of those UKIP voters coming back and voting Conservative, because they generally are of a Conservative disposition. I know that people argue about this, but if you look at their councillors, if you look at their activists, a lot of them have come from the Conservative Party.
Yeah, I mean what we're seeing sort of at the moment in the US 2014 primaries is a lot of Tea Party challengers losing, but Tea Party ideas being sort of brought
adopted.
And really there's the narrative's been about the establishment versus the Tea Party, but in a way a lot of the primary victors in the Republican primaries are sort of fusion candidates who
That's right. Well, the difficulty that we have with UKIP is that they're not part of the Conservative Party. I mean, the Tea Party generally in the US, as far as I can see and have followed, are within the Republican Party. So they're fighting. To a degree, They're fighting
more
primaries.
so than UKIP, certainly.
That's right. They're fighting primaries within the Republican Party. So it's a battle within the Republican Party. Whereas UKIP are fielding other candidates as a separate party. That may well be a development of the Tea Party. I mean, the Tea Party could end up being, I suppose, a party challenging the Republican Party. And if that were the case, I think the Republican Party would have a serious problem. Because essentially, instead of contesting primaries and then deciding on one candidate, you would have, you know, the Democrats, the Republicans, and a kind of Tea Party representative. And you had that, I think, with the Ross Perot. That was very much a similar situation, where as a third party, I think he killed Bush in '92.
Right.
And that's very much the danger.
Now, we talked about the sort of political class. I mean, do you see yourself as a professional politician, a lifelong politician?
No, I mean, I've done other things.
You've been in Parliament since what, 2010?
2010, So I've been 4 years, and I'm a writer, historian, worked in a bank for 10 years. I've done different things. And I think it's quite unhealthy, actually, to have professional politicians. I can see why they've evolved, but I think you need to have politicians with a wider perspective. And that was always a great strength of the House of Commons, I think. The House of Commons drew on people from all sort of backgrounds in many ways. You had manual workers. I'm talking about the mid-20th century. You had people, you know, like Winston Churchill, who was a sort of journalist, writer, soldier. You had quite eccentric characters. You had people from different walks of life, different professions. And I think that added to a sort of diversity and a variety. You didn't just hear the same voices. The nature of modern life, people are more specialized. There's a huge culture of being a special advisor, or, you know, in American case, working on the Hill. And I think that has sort of bred its own, kind of got its own momentum. And
I think you're saying that the three party leaders currently in Britain are all essentially professional politicians.
Well, if you look at them, I mean, this is a fact. They were all, I think, born within 3 years of each other, between 1966 and 1969. So they're all exactly the same age. They all went to either Oxford or Cambridge. And they all, as their first job out of university, worked in politics, and that's a fact. And Nigel Farage, the head of UKIP, comes along. Yes, he went to a private school, but he didn't go to university. He didn't actually. He doesn't have a degree.
Yeah.
You know, and so he can say, look, I'm not like these guys. I've actually worked as a commodity trader. I've done this. You know, I'm an ordinary bloke. I'm an ordinary guy. And that may be false. I mean, he's been a politician as long as I can remember, actually. But, you know, it has a sort of grain of truth.
Yeah.
And people who are angry, you know, they're not looking for a forensic sort of truth. They're not looking to analyze all the circumstances. They just want a story. And his story is quite convincing, superficially.
And, I mean, your own sort of personal... I'm always very struck... I mean, I write for the British press,
sure,
but I'm based here, but the sort of obsession, in a way, in Britain, or maybe it's just with the British press, with class and schooling.
Absolutely.
Now, you yourself, you went to Eton, the top
Eton,
public, meaning private boarding
That's right.
school.
I mean, Eton is a very famous school.
Yeah, and the same, as did David Cameron.
That's right. I mean, I have a slightly unusual background because my parents were immigrants from Ghana, which was part of the old British Empire. So my first book was about empire, Ghosts of Empire.
Yeah.
So I have an unusual relationship with the British establishment, insofar as my parents are immigrants. They came to Britain in the 60s. I was brought up in London, but then I went through these elite institutions.
You went to Cambridge University?
I was at Cambridge University. And so I kind of got both sides, if you see what I mean. I mean, my parents were very much from the old colonial empire. Kwarteng is a very common name in Ghana, not so common in Britain. Maybe it is more now, but... and so I could see sort of both sides, if you like. But I think, and with that double hat, I would say that there was a problem, I think. There is potentially a problem in that, you know, people from more marginal backgrounds, you know, do struggle to get a voice.
Yeah.
And I think it's very important that as a political class we open ourselves up. You know, people who are active in politics, not just in Britain but in America, should be more open, and there should be a much easier way for people to be able to come through and get representation, and maybe, you know, be representatives themselves. But the nature of the media, the nature of modern communications, modern life, if you like, means that you have to be quite specialized. You have to decide to do that at a relatively young age. And that creates this class, I suppose.
Now, is it 3 books you've written in the last 4 years?
Two big ones, and I've co-written a couple of others.
Yeah. I mean, I noticed you haven't tweeted since 2010.
I'm quite old-fashioned.
And you don't have kids. But how have you, even so, I mean, how do you manage to write something as thoughtful and wide-ranging?
That's very kind. I mean, I think the best advice, the 2 things about writing a book. The smartest thing that anyone ever said about writing a book was actually Winston Churchill. He said, it's like building a house. You've got to work out how many floors the house is. You've got to work out what the external structure of the house is. You've got to work out how many rooms and bedrooms, all the rest of it, before you worry about, you know...
And Churchill actually built houses.
He did build houses, absolutely. But you've got to work out the structure before you work out, you know, what the quilts your duvet is going to have, or, or you know, how your sofa is going to appear, or what the patio is going to be like in the garden. You've got to actually look at the actual structure. And so once you've got a structure, then the second thing about writing a book is, I don't know whether it's an African proverb, but if you want to eat an elephant, you've got to chop it up into little pieces.
Right.
So once you've got the house, then you've just got to take a very gradual approach. In a book like that, people think you just rustle it out of thin air. I mean, it took about 6 years. I mean, when was the financial crisis? 2008. And I was thinking about it even before 2008.
I mean, your PhD was in economic history.
That's right. So I'd studied economic history at Cambridge University. I'd done quite a bit here when I spent my year abroad in Boston. And so these thoughts have been evolving for quite a while. I mean, I've always been interested in gold, and you know, I suppose from the African continent, my home country used to be called the Gold Coast.
Right.
So there was always that sort of interest, and looking at, you know, in politics in terms of finance, and worked in a bank for 8-9 years, and all of that came together. And I took a very gradual approach in writing the book. And of course, when the book appears, everyone says, how did you do that? It must have taken you 3 months. But actually, it takes a much longer time.
And do you have a routine, a certain number of hours a day, at a certain time of the day?
There are certain moments in the week. Monday mornings are quite good. Saturday afternoons are good. and then in the recess I try and allocate a bit of time every day.
Yeah.
It's the eating the elephant thing, chopping it up into small pieces.
Right, so it's
and then you just do steady as you go. And then you know, if you've got a clear idea of what the sort of book you want to write, you can actually get there.
Yeah.
I mean, the danger is, but you need to keep to the structure, and you need a plan. Now, if you don't have a plan, it's practically impossible to do something like that, given the pressures and the constraints you have, you know, the amount of time you spend in the constituency. But my constituency is quite close to London. I'm struck, when I've been to the National Archive, I've bumped into constituents because they're interested in their family history. And, you know, it's a hobby. You know, people have hobbies, even if they work very hard.
Yeah.
So it's not something that I see as work, really.
Right, although extremely relevant.
Well, I try and make it relevant.
I mean, that historical perspective is a thing that I think a lot of politicians sometimes lack.
I think it's key. I think it's absolutely key to trying to understand modern politics. You've got to understand where we've come from. And I think it was, again, Winston Churchill or someone like that. He said, you know, if you don't read the past, you're condemned to make the same mistakes. And I think that's very true.
And one of the things that struck me as well, I said right at the beginning, this is not sort of a politician's book. I mean, it's not a polemic.
No.
You're not judgmental. Obviously, you select, as everyone does. But does this help your political career? I mean, how does David Cameron view it?
I don't think it particularly. I didn't write it to get up the greasy pole. But you know, history and understanding history is a more of a medium to long term thing than, you know, trying to get appointments week by week.
Yeah.
But I think in the long run, I think, you know, you've got to clearly set out what your beliefs are, where you're coming from, your kind of intellectual hinterland, if you like. And I think that's got to help a political career in the end. And I think that certainly in Britain, I'm not sure about the United States, but there's always been quite a big connection between understanding history and politics.
Yeah.
We've had a long tradition of historians in politics and politicians who write history.
Yeah.
Churchill, who I've mentioned many times, is probably the greatest example of that.
Yeah.
He wrote reams and reams of history throughout his career.
Yeah.
And if he was on this show, I mean, he wrote a history of the First World War in 6 volumes while he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. I have no idea how he managed to do that.
Yeah.
But, you know, other people like Roy Jenkins. Roy Jenkins was a writer. Our current Foreign Secretary, William Hague, has written excellent biographies of British politicians. It's something that is quite connected in Britain.
Yeah.
You know, this link between history and politics.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite healthy, actually.
Yeah. And there's a great quote in there from, which almost goes against this, from Norman Lamont, who said politicians don't have the luxury of expressing doubt.
It's true.
But I sense from here, you know, you use the word nuanced quite a lot, that you do have a nuanced view of things.
I mean,
are there things that surprised you, things that you studied that actually changed your view?
Yeah, I mean, they did. I mean, I think if you look at this whole idea of government spending, I mean, what I was amazed at was the extent to which we're living in completely uncharted territory. As I say, for hundreds of years before 1971, there was a gold standard. Until it was only really in the 60s that people kind of challenged, certainly in Britain and America, challenged this idea that we've got to balance the budget every year. And so this idea where we're running continual deficits and we've got a paper-backed currency, fiat money, is quite new. I mean, this just wasn't something that happened before 1971. And certainly after 1971, you know, the extent to which we were spending more money wasn't as pronounced as it is today. And these bailouts and this QE.
So it's the sort of new normal, but it doesn't have to be that way.
It doesn't have to be that way. It's quite new. I mean, QE, quantitative easing. I mean, who heard of that? More than 10 years ago. Who had ever heard of QE? I think I first heard it in 2007. That phrase, and then it became a kind of, you know, one of these received sort of phrases that you would think had existed since, you know, God was a boy, but it didn't.
Right.
It was new, and so the extent to which today's situation, today's circumstances are relatively new was something that struck me.
Right. Now, and what of your political career? I mean, the term Black Boris, which is a reference to Boris Johnson,
that's right,
Mayor of London. I mean, I think you've been floated as sort of a British Obama.
Well, every politician of colour, I think, you know, black, ethnic, whatever, in Britain is touted as the British Obama. Yeah. Which isn't, I mean, given Obama's poll ratings, perhaps isn't something that one would necessarily aspire to be. But, I mean, we've got to get through the 2015 election. Yeah. I mean, I've got to hold my seat, which I hope to do. And
got a healthy, what, 10,000 majority?
Yes,
healthy,
but you know, majorities can come and go, and I think, you know, in this UKIP thing, that's something that, you know, I've got to keep an eye on. Let's see where we are after 2015. I mean, the whole political sort of career thing, debate, in terms of where people are going, is dependent on your party's success.
Right.
And obviously, I'm hoping that the Conservative Party, you know, win resoundingly, and then, you know, my career will go in a different direction.
Right.
If we're out, you know, who knows what will happen?
Yeah. Yeah. Now, you got another book in the
works? Well, I'm toying with a few things. I mean, I'm very interested in Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah. Because
obviously she's a key figure in the book in many ways.
And I interviewed Charles Moore on afterwards.
Oh yes.
About his biography.
It's a great book. Yeah. Great book. I mean, I know Charles well. He'd been working on that for a very long time. But Thatcher, I think, was one of those figures, certainly in British life, who immediately became a kind of iconic figure. Once she died, you knew that she was someone that people were going to argue about for decades to come. And there are very few, I mean, I'm nearly 40, but there are very few people in my lifetime in Britain who had that sort of iconic status.
Right.
I mean, I mentioned Churchill earlier, but he died 50 years ago. This is before my time. But Thatcher, for my generation, whether you loved her or loathed her, was a key figure.
Yeah.
And I'm very interested in her leadership style. Not just that she was a woman, but, you know, she had a nonconformist Methodist background. Her father was a Methodist lay preacher. She had a lot of sort of religious imagery, which she used. She was almost like a sort of preacher. In terms of her style.
And she was a big inspiration to you. One of the reasons.
Well, yeah, she was. I mean, she was an inspiration. I mean, she became Prime Minister when I was 4 years old, so I don't really remember that. And I remember the day she left. I was probably 15 and a half. So that was a very long time where she was this sort of dominant figure in British politics, a whole decade where she was Prime Minister. And I liked her style of politics. I liked the conviction politics. I liked the fact that she stuck to her guns. And she said, I mean, I was doing a bit of research about her. 3 months before the 79 election, she said, I am not a consensus politician. I mean, you could imagine someone saying that 3 months before an election.
Right.
Saying, I'm not a consensus politician. If you want the compromise and all of that stuff, vote for someone else. I stand on principle. And I think there was something very attractive about that. And I could see it creeping in American politicians, because there's a feeling, certainly among certain Republicans, that, you know, they've been trying to trim their sails to whatever wind is passing. Right. And it's very difficult for many people to see what the Republican Party is about. And they think, we need principle, we need some kind of clear convictions. Now, the danger of that is that people might not like your convictions.
Right. That's a risk you take.
That's a risk you take. But I think, you know, there are certain ways in which, and she had incredible communication skills. I mean, I mentioned Reagan. They did have great communication ability. And I think that was very attractive at that time.
So look out perhaps for the next book to be something about
something about her leadership style. But I assure you, it won't be nearly as long as this book.
Right.
It'll be a much shorter book. But I'm looking to, you know, doing a bit more research on it.
Right. Well, Kwasi Kwarteng, this is a wonderful book. Congratulations, and thank you very much for being on Afterwards.
Thank you.
Welcome to Afterwards. I'm Toby Harnden of the Sunday Times of London. And with me today is Kwasi Kwarteng, a Conservative MP who's born in London of Ghanaian parents. And he's here to discuss his superb new book, War and Gold, a 500-year history of empires, adventures and debt. It's received rave reviews already. My own paper described it as enormously readable and an entertaining history which turns the past 500 years into a rollicking narrative. So great to have you here.
Very good to be here. Thank you.
Now, rollicking narrative is not usually the description you get for politicians' books, and this strikes me as not really a politician's book. This isn't designed to sort of get you further up the greasy pole.
No.
Why did you write it?
Well, I've always been interested in history. That was what my major was in. I've also got a doctorate in history. And I think that when we look at what happened in 2008, the financial crisis, huge amounts of debate, loads of books, but they all looked at very short-term perspective, through a short-term perspective. They were looking at the banks, they were looking at maybe hedge funds, they were looking at CDOs and credit derivatives. But I thought, hang on, let's take a step back and actually try and understand something about the global financial system, something about the currencies that we have, the dollar, sterling, and also the nature of gold as well, because one of the features of this book is to remind people that we, for 400 years, for 450 years, of the 500-year period, we had a gold-backed currency.
Yeah.
And it was only in 1971 when Richard Nixon famously went off gold. He shut the gold window.
Now tell me about that. One of the things I love about this is you have an eye for the dramatic moment.
That's right.
And I mean, it's about, you know, an ostensibly sort of dry subject, sort of money.
Sure.
But tell me about that moment in 1971 when the TV programme was interrupted.
Well, there are key moments in any history, in any historical narrative. There are always going to be key moments when people just step back and think, oh my God, this is what's happening. And 1971, it was August the 15th, I think, on a Sunday, was very much one of those moments when Richard Nixon essentially appeared on national television halfway through Bonanza, which is this great cowboy show. It's probably not really my time, but maybe viewers will remember that show. And he interrupted the show to say, we're not going to allow the dollar to be converted into gold anymore. And this, in many ways, was one of the most significant events, the most significant things to have happened in the history of money. And it was a very decisive moment where essentially he shut the gold window, that's what the term was, where people could not simply come into Fort Knox, metaphorically, and say, here, at $100, I want to get the gold value. And that was as a consequence of, you know, the big, bad problems that the American government, the federal government, had got into with its debt. They were trying to fight the Vietnam War and also pay for the Great Society. And it just didn't work out. There was a huge billion. And the House of Commons just nodded it through because they would do whatever it took to defeat Germany. That was the attitude.
And obviously a thread right the way through here, and in the title is this sort of push-pull effect of war.
Absolutely right.
And money. And you contemplated calling the book Order and Chaos. Order
and Chaos, that's right. I mean, I'll tell you, I mean, order, I think, is represented by the gold standard or by a commodity standard where you can see that, you know, this is how much my dollar or my pound is worth, and it's linked to some sort of external value, a commodity, for example. Chaos, and one of the arguments I put forward in the book is that we're in a period of relative chaos at the moment, is when you don't have any kind of mooring to commodities. You have what is called fiat money, paper money, and essentially you're just at the mercy of the printing press. You can just keep printing money. And there is a strand of opinion, certainly in this country, probably more than any other, which says that that was a mistake. We should get back to the gold standard. It's associated with people like Ron Paul and people like that. But my this isn't a polemic. I'm not trying to write a really good narrative to explain how we got to where we are. But I think there is some force in the argument that, you know, hang on, we need something more structured than just the ability of governments to print money.
Yeah, I mean the quotes from Ron Paul and his co-authoring, I think 1981,
that's
saying
right.
The 10-year experiment with paper money has failed.
That's right.
And I mean that is an argument that is very, very...
there was a deficit, there was a trade deficit, and people like the French and bad people like the Brits were coming to change dollars into gold. And so Richard Nixon decided to stop that. Interestingly enough, the federal chairman at the time, the head of the Federal Reserve, Arthur Burns, was very skeptical about that. I mean, he was an old school kind of balanced budget conservative guy, and he was very wary of actually stopping the decoupling the dollar from gold in that way.
And another key moment, dramatic moment, is Lloyd George in the House of Commons in 1914.
That's right.
Another big year.
We see the great thing about British public finance for the 100 years before the First World War, before 1914, was essentially they ran balanced budgets. I mean, it's difficult to imagine that now, but the whole of the Victorian era and the 19th century, and these guys with top hats and
a stable interest rate.
Very stable interest rates, very stable fiscal policy. And what happened in the First World War, and this is one of the key moments of the book, was that all of that just went to pieces. So in order to defeat the Kaiser, in order to defeat Germany, the British Parliament essentially had to vote through massive spending. And he stands up and says, you know, this is an extraordinary thing that we've done. We're going to now borrow billions of sterling, whereas generally it had been hundreds of millions, the budget, up to that point. But they borrowed huge amounts. The national debt went up 10 times, if you can imagine, more than 10 times. So from about 700 million sterling to over 11 billion.
Resonant here, I mean, there was a big following for Ron Paul in 2008, 2012. His son, Senator Ron Paul, is probably going to run for president in 2016. I mean, do you think we should return to the gold standard? Could we?
Well, there's a different factor in terms of how we could. I'll talk about that initially. The only way we can get back to the gold standard, I mentioned that in this book, is for the Chinese, essentially, to decide unilaterally. They could reinstitute the gold standard tomorrow. They could say, right, a yuan or a renminbi is going to equal X amount of gold. And they've got enough reserves to back that. The only problem for them is that they run an export model. So if they did that, the yuan would become a very, very strong currency, which would be complete reverse of their export-led growth policy, where they want to keep the value of the yuan low so that their exports are cheap and we can buy them, essentially. So that would be a complete reversal. But in terms of actually introducing a gold standard, they can do it because they've got the reserves. And one of the points I make about the gold standard is that if you look at the 19th century, it was Britain who largely sort of guaranteed it. And Britain was running great export surpluses. I mean, Britain was the manufacturer of the world. British goods were flooding, essentially, global markets, not least in America, in South America. And the reserves that Britain acquired through its export trade meant that they could keep a gold standard. Now, the British themselves, we never really had that much gold, but everyone sort of relied on the stability and the export strength.